We have what is effectively a policeman of the internet, not just in Britain, but which currently believes it has the ability to regulate, effectively means censor, the internet all over the world.
In part 2, Alex Klaushofer talks about Ofcom and censorship powers she sees as antithetical to a free society.
What people are not talking about so far is Ofcom's latest plans, which are to impose a compliance burden pretty much across the internet.
Alex says plans for increased Ofcom powers would regulate some of Britain's internet out of existence.
If you can imagine everything that has made Britain vibrant and interesting, and to use a slightly misused word, diverse, over the last couple of centuries, and then translate that into online life, and imagine a lot of that gone, and what is there heavily curtailed and censored, then that is what the result would be.
Alex says we need to wake up to our freedoms being taken away before it's too late.
So, to anyone who says it couldn't happen here in Britain, I would say look at the legislation that has been passed and is going through Parliament as we speak now, and think about whether that is consistent with a democracy or whether it really looks more like an oppressive regime.
I also wanted to talk to you a bit about Ofcom. You've been doing quite a bit of research into this area. And can you start by telling us kind of what Ofcom is for viewers who might not be so sure, and what it kind of originally set out to do?
Ofcom originally set out as a broadcast regulator and a consumer body protecting the rights of consumers in telecommunications, both of which are reasonable functions. And today we have what is effectively a policeman of the internet, not just in Britain, but which currently believes it has the ability to regulate, effectively means censor, the internet all over the world. So Ofcom has come a very long way, to put it kindly, in a short time. The notable thing, or the concerning thing, is that it has got all this power through the Online Safety Act, which now strikes me as something like an enabling piece of legislation, which hands over a huge amount of power on the basis of a certain idea, which to some people sounds quite good, but effectively gives the new organisation, Ofcom, almost unlimited powers. And our Parliament, our British Parliament in a liberal democracy, chose to give Ofcom that level of power and to create the kind of censorship that we're now seeing and that we may well see if they're not checked over the next few years, which is huge.
And do you think it's natural that any company should have that kind of power or control over people's access to information?
Not if you've learnt the lessons of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Not if you've already decided that actually freedom is essential to human flourishing, which I thought we decided, to go back to the question that we started with at the beginning of the conversation. Of course not. So I think a lot of people haven't joined the dots between what they're doing. There's too much falling for new ideas such as safety and the avoidance of harm, which is the fundamental ideological shift that has come about, which has enabled Ofcom to get these powers. And what people are not talking about so far is Ofcom's latest plans, which are to impose a compliance burden pretty much across the internet. Very complicated. There's a huge document which they've just finished a consultation on, with all sorts of categories and requirements, which are too much to go into here. And anyway, even though I've studied it a lot, I can never remember them because it's such a sort of monster of a document. But basically, it would impose a compliance burden on online services. So that's websites, forum, and particularly podcasts and live broadcasts, live streams, that would be impossible for all but the biggest to meet, both in terms of skills, resources, and also money. And so effectively, they would either close down or curtail themselves so that they don't grow to a certain size, or just not start. And one of the significant things is that in that document, Ofcom repeatedly acknowledges that this would be a consequence of those measures. It minimises them because it doesn't seem to have an understanding of the kinds of people who are on the internet and part of the British ecosystem. And, you know, how diverse and vibrant it is and how many small groups and individuals it consists of. It repeatedly says that, yes, there would be consequences, but that is not important compared to harm. It even does rights assessments as a sort of exercise at the end of each proposal and says, yes, this would change, this would damage privacy, this would damage freedom of expression, this would damage freedom of association. Remember now, post-COVID, we all meet on Zoom and so on a lot. But that's much less important than avoiding harm. And then you get back to the centralised thing. Who decides what constitutes harm? Right. So, and you've got one organisation, as I say, with now global aspirations, who wants to decide what is and isn't harmful for users of the British internet.
So as you mentioned, we could lose a lot of the smaller websites, niche forums, things like that. What do you think, if these measures do go through, we're losing as a culture? Can you help us understand that side of it?
If you can imagine everything that has made Britain vibrant and interesting, and to use a slightly misused word, diverse, over the last couple of centuries, and then translate that into online life and imagine a lot of that gone, and what is there heavily curtailed and censored, then that is what the result would be. I suppose you would have a kind of internet in which, yes, you would have the big players such as Facebook remaining, but really limiting what can be discussed, including discussion of current events. So Ofcom has proposals about how to preemptively censor discussion of crises. So you would still have the big players' platforms there. You would obviously have government websites and websites of big institutions and charities, and perhaps then some very sort of small innocuous sites dealing in a very careful way with local affairs, as long as they don't mention things like mobility restrictions or solar farms or whatever. I think of it as kind of cats and cakes. You know, it's that sort of thing when the part of Facebook where people are showing pictures of day excursions and nice meals they've had and animals being funny, which I love too, but that is not really why I go to the internet. Yeah. Something like that.
A bit like the kind of homogenisation of the high streets, you know, where the big brands come in and you lose all the small, cool shops. The same thing would happen to our online culture.
Crossed with children's TV.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, because the overwhelming sense that I get from the way Ofcom and its supporters talk is they really think of us, the public now, as children who need to be very, very carefully managed and protected. And, you know, some of us are always potentially delinquent. and other of us just cannot cope. We might be exposed to something, and so they must manage and decide. So it's a certain view of, it's not even just children in general, it's a certain view of childhood that I certainly didn't have, that many of us didn't have, where the idea was that you, without being exposed to real danger, that you learnt to deal with risk and difficult things so that you could grow up and become a proper adult and a fully functioning human. So I suppose, as a further answer to your question, if that kind of online culture came in and stayed with everything else, we become, as a society, we would become something like a cross between children and possibly even livestock. You know, a body of living beings who do not have autonomy or agency and must not.
The word they like to use is proportionality for a lot of this. Yes, you are losing these freedoms, but these safeties are being introduced and it all kind of balances up. What are your thoughts on that approach?
Well, it makes no sense, but I think I would want to amplify that out, to broaden it. I think, well, okay, yeah, we're making a choice here. Do we want to become those kinds of human beings who have no autonomy and have lost the capacity to assess risks, to create new things, to make our own decisions, to be different from one another, and to be different from the way we were when we were younger, to change and evolve over a lifetime? That, proportionally, do we want that, or do we want to be controlled and managed to the point where we become entirely different kinds of creatures? That's the proportion, that's the thing you're weighing up, not harm versus people being dangerous, not harm versus danger. That's a complete red herring. So it's all about seeing the real things, what the real choices that you're being asked to make, what you're really asked to go along with and accept, rather than just the surface, the words like, you know, harm, health, and so on.
The Online Safety Act, the punishments, the fines are enormous for those who go against it. But we're seeing quite a few international companies that are just refusing, and I think there's a few legal things going on. What do you think this Online Safety Act says to other countries about Britain? How do you think they see us?
My impression from commentators in other countries is that Britain is going down fast. Some of it, I have to say, is a bit overdramatic. But they see us as a kind of warning sign, a dangerous case study.
With the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, to me that makes sense. We are clearly an experiment country, perhaps like Canada has been for some time, and Australia. And yeah, so incredulity, and I do feel embarrassed about Britain. You know, given our history, given how much we've said and done in terms of democracy and basically civilised attitudes, and just a generalised real tolerance that, okay, you might not like something or someone, but you don't have the right to shut them down or to scream and shout and call them names, which is what a lot of people do as well here now. So this is not all about the top-down institutions and government and so on. There's also a culture which has really shocked me among people, my contemporaries, even people I know, who now seem to believe that it's acceptable, if you disagree with someone, to just call them names in public. Basically, it's abuse. And somehow they think that that's virtuous because they're making their disapproval clear. And, of course, the reception of Charlie Kirk's death in the UK is an example of that. And once again, you've got the split in Britain between those who are appalled at the exulting that's come from some quarters and the attacks on him as a kind of proxy, a representative of free speech, and those who think that's okay.
This was always a classic thing of British culture, wasn't it? That you and I could disagree, and we could have very different opinions, but at the same time we could accept that the other person can have that opinion and treat each other with respect. It's almost being lost in modern times.
Yeah, very much so. And you would also accept that people could behave quite badly in they might say things that were really not very nice, and that you would just let that go. Yeah. You would accept that that was where they were as an individual. You'd say, when I was growing up, that's just so-and-so, that's how they are. And I think we were like that until about a decade ago. So, as I say, it's not just about the top-down institutions. They can't do this. They can't lead us where we will not follow. So there's something gone on which works in more emotional terms as a society, where how we're reacting against things, how we've become so binary and tribal, and that we feel the need to react instantly and to attack that which does not make us feel good. And as I say, that is something that we can see from ordinary people and institutions that should know better, really, organisations. Something that it's more a kind of move that the theorists of social psychology were addressing after Nazism and Stalinism, where they were asking how was this possible. So it's looking at the social conditions which enable this in the way that Matthias Desmat has more recently in his sort of updated version, and thinking about what the emotions are, what emotions that plays on, what emotions are that enable that, fear, anger, anxiety, and so on. And the way out of that is to become aware of it. So, in recent decades, during my lifetime, we've very much had a culture whereas on an individual, personal basis, we've become much more psychologically aware of, how we work and how our personal relationships work, when there's abuse, when we might be overreacting, those sorts of things. But what we haven't done yet is make the link to how that works in social terms, in psychosocial terms, and therefore we don't understand when we're being manipulated to be hostile against other groups and individuals. If we could get that awareness, that kind of awareness that we've had, that we've been developing on a personal basis into society, then we would just be much stronger and more resilient. And we do see some of that in the people that have become aware over the last few years of how things work, how so many feelings and emotions are used for political and commercial ends. Then we're just much stronger. We're equipped, basically.
The other thing I wanted to get your opinion on this subject, Ofcom is kind of trying to become the sheriff of the world's internet and expecting companies in other countries to comply. And it seems the Australian regulator's doing the same. I mean, why is that happening? What's their thinking?
To get into the mindset of this kind of thinking, it goes back to the idea that the population are children and that there is always potential danger. So there's two components, really. One is that the world is a very, very dangerous place, and as humans, we can potentially eradicate that danger by doing the right things. Obviously a false belief. And then the other belief is that the population on the whole are not equipped to assess their own risks, to have the kind of psychological resilience to see difficult things and to make their own decisions. So that seems to be their mindset. Having listen to discussions online between basically censors who are, discussing, well, what can we do more to make things safe, to protect people from harm and exposure. It's this twin idea. We are helpless beings in a terrifying world, and they are our saviours. So it's not that they're entirely malicious, it's just that they've basically lost the plot about reality. Because the reality is that the world is not like that. There is danger, but not as much as that. But in any case, you cannot eradicate it. Think Canute, who of course was, I think he was trying to actually teach his subjects a lesson that you couldn't actually control the sea. But the popular version of the Canute story is that he's trying to do something impossible. So, the censors, the would-be global censors, because they will not succeed. It is impossible to stop humans talking. Anybody who's ever trying to chair a meeting or teach a class knows it's impossible to stop humans talking, chatting, speculating. But they are in this very disconnected mindset, which I think is also understandable through the lens of social psychology and the thinking of Hannah Arendt and people, where everything's become very abstract as a problem. And they're not actually connected on a psychological and emotional and common sense way to how people are and how the world is. And that you could broaden that out again and say, well, this is very much a feature of Western society, and link that to our great belief in science and scientific materialism, the focus on that rather than meaning, values, and the possibility of change based on those kinds of things, and a full acceptance that human beings are creatures of emotion. That's why we're humans and we're not machines. And once you accept that and go with that, you're then in very different territory, because you're thinking about, well, how can we collectively, without trying to control each other, get ourselves to a point where we're increasing our positive emotions, from which much more positive decisions and essentially a positive world will emerge. But control, whether it's in the form of censorship or surveillance or punishments or all of these things that we've talked about, only ever leads to more negativity, because you have to suppress your emotions and your impulses, and it of course engenders anger, anxiety and fear. And we should have learnt the lessons by now from the totalitarian regimes of the recent past, and from the excellent dystopian fiction that Britain has produced. And I'm thinking not just of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, but also C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength, and Forster, The Machine Stops. Those have been telling us for a long time where on our current approaches, before even the technology was developed, where we could go. And we really need to be listening and thinking about that to them, rather than those dangerous inner voices, a lot of which actually come from government ministers, that will say, oh, it'll be all right. Oh, they've got our data anyway. Oh, it's just convenient, or it's inevitable. We should not be listening to those voices. We should be listening to much wiser ones.
We talked about pushback and non-compliance with regards to the digital ID. I mean, everyone knows about that. It's a bit easier. But what about with these Ofcom situations? I mean, I know about it because I'm part of your Substack and I received your report about it. But I think a lot of people, they don't really even know about these things and they just kind of go through.
Yeah, I mean, that is particularly dangerous, because what we're entering, or we have already entered, many would say, is an age of preemptive censorship. So the aspiration of the global sensors, which can be enabled by technology now, including algorithms and AI, is to prevent us from even knowing things in the first place. So I don't have any very clever solutions to that. That's why I think we need to be aware and talking about this and basically letting them know now that this is not what we want and not what we will accept. I do have a personal belief, very much like the kind of story in E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, that whatever people do, however much control is exerted, there will always be a way and there will always be a residual population that somehow remains and knows despite everything. But we don't want to get to that situation. We don't want to be at the point where so much humanity has been lost and there's been so much suffering and lives lost, because this will also involve loss of life as well, that there's a tiny minority and humanity has to sort of start again, which is the moral of that story. So we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the censorship and everything that it means very loudly and very freely.
You did a great series on the kind of hidden mechanisms of unfreedom on your Substack. We've covered quite a few here, but were there any others that you feel people should really be thinking about this time?
So one that we need to be aware of is what I've called hijacking. It's not necessarily the right word, but some people call it infiltration, but basically ways in which policy making is influenced and even made by organisations outside government. So it's a kind of circumventing of democracy, effectively. And what I've seen through looking at think tanks, British-based think tanks in particular, is that over the last 20 years or so, they've undergone a profound shift where they've morphed from organisations that were basically well-intentioned and exploring ideas on behalf of civil society with the aim of public benefit, and they've become sort of outsourced policy-making bodies which use their apparent independence and the perception of the public, favourable perception of the public, to create the idea that there is support for new ideas, mainly in the form of restrictions and taxes. So this one, coming up to the budget, is quite remarkable in that if you've really met many people that genuinely want tax rises, I'm surprised. Now, I know there are some at the left who want them on certain groups, but they don't really want them themselves. They don't want everything to become more expensive, or certain things to become more expensive, or activities, because that's what tax rises mean. And what a lot of think tanks have done, those on both the left and the right in recent years, is they come up with proposals that are basically about tax rises with detail, arguing for their necessity, and even in some cases recommendations for government as to how they might overcome resistance from the public to paying those increased tax rises. So this is a question that we then need to ask, well, what is going on there? That's not a kind of normal, healthy thing to happen. So why are those think tanks doing that? And the answer quite often lies in their funding. So if you look at who is funding them, sometimes the funding is directly of those proposals and those reports, so it becomes very obvious. And other times, much less so, is just in their funding stream for those of whom that declare it. They don't always. And aside from that, you can sometimes see connections in their people. Their people will actually be working or connected with someone else, which has an interest in pay per mile, for example, or taxes or restrictions on certain kinds of food, those sorts of things. Then what you hear, if you follow some of these measures, you then hear them being proposed by government, and there's potentially no discussion in Parliament. So what should be happening in our system officially is that an elected government comes up with an idea itself, which is hopefully not far from what it's been proposing and offering in its manifesto, and it gets its own civil servants, which is what taxpayers pay for, to start to work out some details, and then it goes through a long consultation process with all sorts of stakeholders, and then a much wider, if that then works, a much wider consultation process with the public, and then a genuine process of parliamentary scrutiny by Parliament, so that the whole process is contained within the system, which voters can scrutinise. But what's happening now is that it's kind of been outsourced out into organisations that seem to have links through finance and personnel, or just their agenda with corporations and supranational organisations who clearly have a certain agenda.
It's like they've farmed out the powers.
Yeah. So it's a way of, it looks to me like it's a way of getting around democracy. And again, once you start to look, it becomes very clear that this is the plan. So the Tony Blair Institute, for example, talks about transforming British governance. So there's a whole language of transformation there, which effectively means moving beyond democracy. Right. And democracy is just the kind of surface appearance which gives the public the impression that they still have some sort of say or control. Because the key thing here with all these measures and the level and kind of control that is aspired to is that it must have consent from people. It cannot work without our consent, because it's so invasive in terms of getting into our everyday lives and our minds. So that is why there's so much focus on consent and information and perception. We're not talking about dictatorships here, which is just, brute force and you'll do this or you get arrested and taken away. This is the kind of shift now where most of a population has to agree or feel so disempowered that they have no alternative.
We've talked about totalitarianism. I'm sure some people would say, well, this can't really happen here, it won't happen to us. What would you say to that?
It couldn't happen here is what people said in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Hannah Arendt makes a very astute point about this, that this belief, this widespread belief that, it just couldn't happen here, it couldn't happen to us, was a key enabler of it actually happening. Right. Because basically you're switched off. You're listening to a kind of internal voice that is giving you false reassurance rather than looking at reality. So to anyone who says it couldn't happen here in Britain, I would say look at the legislation that has been passed and is going through Parliament as we speak now, and think about whether that is consistent with a democracy or whether it really looks more like an oppressive regime. So I'm talking about things like the Crime and Policing Bill, which will give the police powers to enter and search premises. That means your home, without a search warrant, and take things if they see fit. And I think it's the data and access, I may have mixed up the bill, I think it's the data bill or the fraud bill, which gives the Department for Work and Pensions the ability to survey bank accounts. Initially those of benefit recipients, but it could become wider. And then remove money from those bank accounts. It also enables DWD officials to go and search premises. So circumventing the police and the whole question of warrants. And of course, a department like that makes mistakes. So they will be able to do this just on the basis of suspecting things. So when we think about those kinds of things, as well as the ever-growing curtailments of protests and the expansion of police powers, such as facial recognition, what does that look like? Does that look like everything's fine? Or does that look more like the classic things that modern governments who have wanted control have always done in the process of taking control?
Alex Klaushofer, thanks for joining us.